Welcome back, everybody. So in this video we're going to review some of the basics about the religions and philosophies that emerged during the classical era, as well as some religions and philosophies that existed prior to the classical era, but are going to develop a little bit more and change over the course of the classical era. So we're going to go region by region through the world and talk about which things pop up there. So here we go. We're going to start in the Middle East with monotheistic traditions that develop. So this place in the world is kind of unique because of this sort of tradition of monotheism that emerges there in a few different groups of people. So the earliest monotheistic tradition that emerges is Judaism, which was focused early in its history around the city of Jerusalem, although it probably began as a religion just among some group of people, eventually known as the Hebrews or Israelites, within Mesopotamia, part of the Middle East. Now, the early history and teachings and philosophy of the Jews, the Jewish people, is in the Torah, this set of scriptures, which came together, by basically the first millennium BCE. Now, the core of Jewish belief, though, is the idea of the covenant, or an agreement between the Jewish people and the one God, the one exclusive single God of the universe. And in the covenant, the Jewish people agree to follow God's laws, follow God's teachings, his expectations for humanity as revealed to them through prophets like Abraham and Moses. And then if they follow the covenant, if they follow the laws and teachings of God, then God will protect them, love them, favor them, etc. So, now at first though, Jews tended to focus around the city of Jerusalem, and the Jewish people did rule a small kingdom there for some time, very early in the in history. But by the first millennium BCE, the Jewish people in this area was going to be conquered continuously by various empires, by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, by the Persian Empire, by the Roman Empire. And as the Jewish people were sort of conquered and absorbed into these bigger political systems, they start to move, they start to spread, and communities of Jewish people emerge all across the Middle East and across the Mediterranean Sea. Sometimes they're deported forcibly, like under the Babylonian Empire. But sometimes they move purposefully, just to go elsewhere to do business or find land or what have you. But they're never going to be like going to conquer other parts of the world. Now, this scattering of the Jewish people is known as the Diaspora, and that's a word that just means anytime people leave their homeland and settle elsewhere. So, for example, in the United States, Indian people who have left India to live in the United States are part of the Indian diaspora, and Jewish people who lived in Rome were part of the Jewish diaspora. And as that happened, the religion became much less sort of geographically centered around Jerusalem, and every community had their own rabbis or teachers of the Torah who served as really kind of the guides and sort of leaders of the Jewish community. So, the next monotheistic tradition to be aware of is Zoroastrianism. Now, this was a religion that was based in Persia, and as the Persians conquered their empire, the religion came with them, but just like Judaism, it was never a religion that tried to find converts, that tried to spread missionaries around to try and get people to choose their religion. Instead, it was a religion of this group of people, and in Zoroastrianism, the attitude was that there's the one God who created the universe and is good, but he's in a struggle against evil forces in the universe. And your job as a human is to choose the side of good, to support that one God in the struggle. And then you would go to heaven and live in bliss in the afterlife. So you can see the sort of common goal, even though some of the specifics differ, is this idea of proving your quality, proving your goodness, proving that you are willing to follow the one God and be good in order to achieve salvation, to go to heaven, to achieve something good in the afterlife. Christianity is going to be no exception to this rule. Christianity also developed around Jerusalem, within a Jewish community when it was part of the Roman Empire in the first century CE. And of course, the person, Jesus, who served as the basis of the religion, he was from a Jewish community. Now, Jesus, he preached, he taught about, being good, about caring for the poor and the sick and social justice and so on. But along with his teachings, which appealed to lower class people, because basically he promised, if you follow God's laws, no matter who you are or what you are, you can be saved. You can go to heaven and escape the difficulty of your life. So, Jesus' teachings appealed to people from lower classes in society. But as it grew, you start to see these beliefs emerge about Jesus as the Son of God, Jesus as essentially part of God himself. And not only, did he bring these teachings to the world, not only is he a prophet from the one God of Judaism, but he also was part of God himself. And when he was executed through crucifixion on the cross, that was actually a sacrifice made by God to show his love for mankind. So part of Christianity then, the religion about Jesus, was not just accepting the teachings, but also accepting the divinity, the idea that Jesus was actually part of God and not just sent by God. So this is going to be something that really separates it from Judaism, even though the concept of the one God and the laws and the necessity of following God's teachings and expectations is always going to be important in this religion. Now, St. Paul and other missionaries like him, many of whom were Roman citizens, they were central in the spread of this religion through the Roman Empire, from the area around Jerusalem to other cities within the empire. And basically, as the religion spread, it started to grow from an underground religion into something that became more mainstream. And even though originally it was kind of threatening to the Roman state, because Christians refused to worship the emperor and said, hey, there's one God who's above the emperor, actually, it started to find adherents, first among the lower classes, slaves, women, but then among the upper classes. And Constantine, the emperor who ruled Rome, in the 300s during its decline, he became Christian, and he legalized Christianity for the first time in the empire. So, when he did that, he also called together the bishops, the leaders of different Christian communities around the empire, and had them decide what official Christian teaching was going to be. So this coming together of bishops, this coming together of different Christian leaders for the purpose of deciding what orthodox or proper belief was, eventually became the basis of the Catholic Church, a kind of supervisory organization that governed the religion. So even as the Roman Empire declined, the religion of Christianity became more centralized and more organized under the Roman state, and eventually was adopted as the official religion of the Roman state a little later after Constantine. So, now, here we go. In China, in East Asia, during the Warring States era, when China was in a period of disunity, this is when you start to see new philosophies emerging, hoping to restore balance and harmony and order and, I guess you could say, stability to Chinese society. And this is all sort of rooted in a deeper concept of yin and yang, this kind of balance and harmony that hopefully will define the universe and the world. And the role of humans, according to this kind of understanding, is to actually promote balance, promote harmony, in order to make the world sort of work according to the ways of the gods, and that heaven, the collection of all the gods, and the will of the gods would prefer. So legalism was one of the earliest of the new philosophies to emerge during the Warring States. This was adopted briefly by the Qin dynasty, and this essentially said order comes through law, and the strict and even-handed application of law. The two handles, punishment for those who do wrong, to discourage that, and rewards, to encourage people to do good things instead, regardless of social class or background or level in society. So, now, this was harsh, though, So the next dynasty after the Qin adopted Confucianism, based on the teachings of Confucius, who lived around 500-ish BCE as well. So Confucius, he said that in order for society to be stable and harmonious, to please the gods, to please heaven, sages, people who are wise, who understand virtue, who understand responsibility, and ren, this kind of humaneness and looking out for others and fulfilling obligations toward others, that if sages are put in positions of leadership, other people will naturally follow them because they want to be good. They want stability and harmony. So, the people who understand ren, this word that means virtue and humaneness, as well as those who understand filial piety, how to love and respect one's family and parents, that if everyone sort of follows those teachings, then all of society will be a big family, led by, a king or emperor who rules over and governs well. Now, the way to achieve that wisdom, to become a sage, is to become educated. And this kind of made Confucianism something that sort of promoted the idea that anyone from any class could actually become someone who was authoritative and a good leader, as long as they were wise and educated. So, now, finally then you have Daoism, and this is spelled in one of two ways, either with a D or a T. And this is based on the teachings of a philosopher who was called Lao Tzu, about 500 BCE, kind of like Confucius, although once again we don't know exactly if this guy actually existed, but there is a book known as the Tao Te Ching, which collects all of his teachings in it. Now, the basis of Daoism is that harmony and order, rather than being based on law, or being based on good leadership and wise leadership, instead, harmony is based on humans allowing nature to go its natural way, following the Tao, the way of nature, or just simply, allowing nature to take its course. And that if, one actually wants to govern or lead, the way to do so is by not appearing to be leading, by sort of leading indirectly. And it's not totally clear exactly how this works in practice, but this is kind of a mystical philosophy, a sort of mystical religious tradition as well. And out of all three of these, this is the one that is really the most religious, where you sort of take into account supernatural beings and the idea of respecting the supernatural. And Taoists would say that rather than trying to impose order and hierarchy onto the world, like legalists or Confucianists do, instead you should remove that attempt. You should remove that sort of effort, and you should allow the Tao to take its course and allow sort of the world to flow. So, now, off to India, or South Asia. And the two major religious traditions that emerged here were Hinduism and Buddhism. And kind of like in the Middle East, where you have Christianity and Judaism all coming from the same sort of basic religious background, and just like in China, where legalism, Confucianism, and Daoism were all kind of based on these earlier Chinese concepts, in India, you have a couple of religions that sort of share the same DNA, the same sort of basic understanding of the universe. So, the earliest version of this, though, was called Vedic religion. So, the Aryan peoples, as they migrated into India, before the classical era, they brought the Vedas, the set of texts in a language known as Sanskrit, that had rituals to perform to the gods, and had stories about the gods and their powers and so on. And the Vedas and Vedic religion at first was dominated by a class of priests called Brahmins. So, for some time then, the Brahmins were very powerful and really had kind of control over this religious system. But eventually, though, you start to see new scriptures emerging called the Upanishads, which are more sort of philosophical and more sort of explain how the universe works and not just what the gods do. So in the Upanishads, This is the next great set of scriptures in what eventually becomes Hinduism. And here, this is where you see explanations and discussions of these concepts of how the universe works. So Brahman, the sort of universal stuff that, contains everything in existence. And samsara, the idea of the cycle of reincarnation, rebirth, that all beings go through over and over until they sort of understand, the reality of the universe. Now, your soul, your sort of individual being, it's never totally separate from Brahman. But it is kind of divided from Brahman in a sort of illusory way. And every time you are born back into the world, you have some dharma, some spiritual obligations to fulfill, or practical obligations, just things you have to do based on what kind of person you are. And as long as you fulfill your dharma and you are a good person and you do these obligations, you'll have good karma. And that will determine what you are reborn as the next time around. And ultimately the goal is to achieve such a high level of spiritual development by performing your dharma and just becoming more and more aware of the reality of the universe and building up good karma that you will achieve moksha, or liberation, where you are no longer reborn separately, and instead you once again just rejoin Brahman. Now, this became the basis for Hinduism, and some of these beliefs are incorporated into Buddhism later on as well. And remember, in Hinduism, there are gods and goddesses that represent different forces and different aspects of Brahman. So, the creative force, or the preservative force, or destructive forces. But those forces aren't good or evil, they just are, and must be respected. But also, they're never totally separate from Brahman. Now, eventually you have two epic poems, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which also sort of develop Hindu thought a little bit more. And within the Mahabharata, that's where you have the Bhagavad Gita, another piece of great scripture within Hinduism. And this is where Krishna, the god Krishna, explains to Arjuna, the prince who's going to fight his cousins in battle, how his dharma as a warrior, just because of what he is as a warrior, he must go into battle. He must fulfill his dharma, and this is how you be a good person. This is how you accept reality and your place in the world and the universe. And ultimately, by doing so, get closer to achieving moksha. So, now there are other ways of doing Hinduism as well. So bhakti, that's individual devotion to one god or goddess. That's something that develops over time as well. Once again, because people are sort of, reacting to domination of the religion by Brahmins. And people sort of want ways to do the religion more personally, more individually. And also, there is yoga, doing mystical practices like meditation and dance and music and forms of chant or physical activity that kind of get you closer to this spiritual enlightenment. That sort of raise your consciousness above just normal life. So, now though, in about the 500s, so, about the same time as Confucius, and about the same time as Laozi, the Buddha lived in northern India. And the Buddha, once again, he was brought up in this sort of religious background. So this is going to inform the teachings that he brings to the world. So the Buddha, he was a prince. He was from a high-ranking caste near the Himalayas. And he just sort of became, disillusioned with his life, and he started to look for spiritual enlightenment, for spiritual truth. And after going through years and years of searching, he sat down under a tree, the Bodhi tree, meditated for 40 days in some versions of the story, and realized the reality of the universe, and achieved what he called nirvana. Now, essentially, to understand reality, to become sort of blissful and fully aware of reality in this state of nirvana, you had to accept the Four Noble Truths. the basic teachings of the Buddha. And also, the word Buddha just means an enlightened person, someone who has achieved nirvana, who has sort of woken up. So, according to the Four Noble Truths, the caste system is irrelevant. And some aspects of what eventually became Hinduism are irrelevant. However, he did accept that you are reborn into the world. But rather than being reborn because of dharma and karma, instead, he thought that you are sort of trapped in the world, and that the world is kind of an illusion, full of false beliefs and false things and false desires. And the more sort of you are attached to desires and things in the world, you will continue to be reborn because you are trapped. You keep getting sort of pulled back in by these things. But because you desire things, because you're attached to them, your life is going to be defined by suffering. That's the first noble truth. And not suffering like constant terror, but sort of dissatisfaction. You can never be completely happy or blissful because of these attachments. Now, the way to achieve nirvana, to achieve this kind of state of awareness and happiness, is by breaking those desires and attachments. And you don't do that by simply just denying yourself everything, but by following the Eightfold Path, which is a life of moderation and sort of deep concentration and deep meditation. So when you feel desire, when you feel attachment, you let it pass, and you don't sort of get stuck. You don't get trapped by that. Instead, you let it pass, and you no longer give in to the desires. And therefore, once you achieve this state of blissfulness and peace, then, once you have achieved nirvana, and then when you pass on, you will not be reborn. You will escape from the cycle because you have understood how to overcome your suffering. So, now at first then, he didn't really talk about gods or goddesses. He just focused on the practice, on doing Buddhism, doing the Eightfold Path in order to achieve nirvana. So the earliest version of Buddhism, Theravada, is this kind of strict psychological program approach, this kind of individual approach. So, eventually though, as this religion spreads, and it becomes sort of popular briefly in India, but it really becomes more popular in East Asia and Southeast Asia through the work of missionaries and the establishment of monasteries where monks and nuns will go to isolate themselves and devote themselves to the religion. As it spreads, Theravada becomes popular in Southeast Asia, but this is very strict. It's difficult to really be Buddhist in that regard. As it spreads into Central Asia and East Asia, Mahayana Buddhism develops, and that's where you see people incorporating, beliefs that are more religious, like perhaps the Buddha was a god, perhaps he was a savior sent to help mankind. Perhaps, you can pray to him and give offerings to him in exchange for his help. Perhaps there's a heaven where you go to live in bliss, in the afterlife with the Buddha once you achieve nirvana. So all of these new ideas started to emerge within Mahayana, perhaps to sort of make it more appealing to just average people who might not necessarily want to join a monastery, but will want to, achieve some... Sorry, the announcements are starting. I'm taping this right at the end of the school day. So, Buddhism, though, becomes more popular outside of India, and Hinduism remains the most dominant religion within India, partly because it's so diverse, it's so sort of a big umbrella, that even Buddhism is kind of regarded by some Hindus as just part of Hinduism, just one way of doing it based on the teachings of this one particular guy. And it's not really sort of separate from or, better than. It is part of Hinduism. But, Buddhists might argue with this, but these religions are from the same sort of basic DNA, the same basic sort of foundation. So, continuing along then, Greco-Roman philosophy. So Greece was kind of unique because they developed a philosophical tradition And once again, not everyone in Greece is going to be like believing in or doing philosophy, but among part of Greek society, there will be this very humanistic philosophy that emerges, where rather than focusing on the gods and what you need to do to please the gods or the teachings of prophets, you need to simply focus on truth and achieving some ideals. So, also because the gods didn't really teach people about ethics. The gods were just powerful and they just did whatever they want to do. Instead, philosophers focused on using logic and rationalism and the power of the human mind to determine what proper behavior is, to determine truth, and what the ideal of humanity should be, and then tried to achieve that. So, guys like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the great Athenian philosophers, their goal was to find truth above all else in order to understand how best to live their lives and how best to behave as a person and as a citizen in the world. And Socrates, he was kind of famous for saying something like, that an unexamined life, is not really worth living. So, this also led down the path beyond just philosophy and ethics towards science, and the idea that not only can we figure out how humans should behave and how humans work, but let's also figure out how the world works, how nature works, in order to better understand truth. So, you start to see the Greeks making all sorts of scientific observations and developing mathematical principles that are very sophisticated. So, now, also the big three philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they were also notable for their political ideas as well. And even though they were all from Athens, which briefly was a democracy, where all citizens were allowed to vote and actually really kind of forced to vote and participate in government, they were kind of skeptical of democracy because they were worried that people in the world didn't necessarily understand truth and justice. And Plato especially, and then Aristotle after him, his student actually, they had the attitude that people who were wise, who really understood truth and understood ideals of virtue and justice and so on, should be the ones actually in charge of society, looking out for everyone else. And Aristotle famously was the tutor of Alexander the Great. And Aristotle thought that there should actually just be a philosopher king who rules over society. So, moving along. Now, one final thing here. Religion and philosophy in the classical world will have a huge impact on art and architecture. So it will kind of manifest in the world and not just be in people's heads. So Daoism, this focus on the Tao and on the power of nature, and that humans need to kind of adapt to nature and not adapt nature to them. This leads to the development of Taoist landscape painting, a popular artistic style, where the humans are small and the nature is big. But Chinese building in general is based on this kind of emphasis on harmony and balance. And you see symmetry as an important aspect of Chinese building and urban planning. This is the capital city of the Han Dynasty, Chang'an. You can see it's a totally symmetrical grid. Hindu temples will have a pretty common standard pattern as well, where you see a huge tower over a room containing a shrine to a particular god and goddess. And usually these are very ornately decorated and sculpted and so on. In Buddhism, stupas are mounds, which eventually turn into bigger temples, but they originally were just mounds of earth that contain Buddhist relics that you might be able to pray to or go and meditate near in order to help you achieve nirvana. And Buddhist icons will always show the Buddha with the big ears to represent his, rich earrings that he used to wear when he was a prince, and the compassion he has for, all the suffering of the world. And in Christianity, you also see Christian icons that represent Jesus in different ways. So at first, early in the Roman Empire, he was usually depicted as someone poor, from the working class background that he was actually from. But eventually, once Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire, he's presented in a more kingly and, well-dressed fashion, usually with some kind of halo around him to represent the sort of holiness within him. And Greco-Roman buildings, kind of like Chinese buildings, will often emphasize symmetry and sort of perfection, not because of this idea of yin and yang, like in China, but because of the kind of idealism and perfection that humanistic philosophers in Greece were trying to achieve. So, that's it for this video. Thank you, and see you next time.